Hello and welcome back to my very frozen white garden. I'm down here in eastern North Carolina, and if you haven't been paying attention to the news, we had this crazy storm come up from the Gulf of Mexico, and it met a Arctic blast coming down from Canada, and thus the two made a lot of mess, ranging all the way from Louisiana, I think it was actually Texas, all the way up to I think maybe Virginia. Yeah, Virginia even got some snow. So since everything is covered in snow today, I really can't do a project per se. I could start sowing seeds in the greenhouse, but I think I'm going to leave that over the weekend, and I'll show you either what I'm sowing or how I sow my seeds. Many of you who have been watching the channel for a while kind of know how I sow my seeds, but maybe you're new to gardening. You want some hints, tips, suggestions, etc. So maybe I'll do that. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want to see that. In the meantime, today what we're going to do is touch on something that I touched on in the previous video, which was about starting gardening. And one of the things I mentioned was knowing what's beneath our feet is so important. And I didn't realize how important it was until I started gardening. I'm going to try to keep this video as brief and as simple as possible. If you guys think I'm wrong on something, please feel free to correct me. I tried to do as much homework as I could, and I wrote down a ton of notes here. And if you guys think I'm missing out on something, please leave those comments below so that, again, if you're new to gardening or if you just even are questioning, like, why does it matter what's beneath our feet, check out the comments below, because somebody may offer a further explanation or suggestion or something else along those lines. So without further ado, because it is cold outside, so I want to try to make this video as quick as possible. You hear the people use the term dirt a lot, and dirt to me is it's a very general term. What most of us are standing on most of the time is soil, and soil can be regarded as, according to some definitions, is made up of minerals, and then you have organic matter mixed in there. Generally a type of humus, and I'll get more into that later on. Decomposing leaves, grass clippings, it all goes towards making up soil. And what we're standing on generally is super duper important. And again, I didn't realize how so. And I'll touch more on that in further explanation in a minute or two. So there's different types of soil, and I'm just going to go over broad views here. If you guys really want to dig further into this, and because you can go down a really deep rabbit hole as to what makes up the ground beneath our feet and why it's important, then feel free. I'm keeping this as basic as I can for time. Clay, sand, loam, and silt. And those are basically your four general types of soil. And then, of course, you can have various combinations. So here in eastern North Carolina, where I am, I'm on a sort of sandy, silty, and there's probably this clay about a foot down. But so it's a sandy, silty, clayey kind of, I really don't like it, but that's the best way to describe it. And of course, on top of that is topsoil, and I'll speak more about that in a little while. I know other gardeners who have very clay-like soil, and they're further inland from me. And so their soil is very thick. It retains a lot of moisture. It's very dense. Thick and dense are basically the same thing, but you guys get what I'm saying. And then there's other gardeners. So for instance, if you guys ever watched Garden Answer, Laura out in Oregon, she's in high desert, and she has a very sandy soil. It's not sand, but it's sandy-ish. So it's much looser, more free-draining material. So now, why is this important? So to understand or to know why these things. Why can't I just dig a hole in the ground and just drop a tree in there? Well, you can, or you could dig a trench and drop some carrot seeds or something, but your soil does matter because it will impact what you're trying to grow or how you're trying to grow it. So for instance, let's pick Russian sage. Russian sage is a common plant. You'll hear about it. You'll see it in many garden centers. It will not grow in a clay-based soil because it likes very free-draining soil. If you put it in a clay-based soil, it will either die or just perform super duper badly. If you put it in a very sandy soil, like I had up on Long Island, it will thrive. It loves it because the water drains away from the roots quickly and the plant just will thrive. Let's pick a cactus. If you take a cactus out of the desert where the soil is very free draining and you put it into a swamp, it's going to die. I'm using sort of extremes, but this is why it's important to understand what you have beneath your lawn, beneath your feet, and why it's important. The other reason that the ground is important beneath our feet is because it's full of life. There's a lot of stuff within that soil that is alive. And depending upon where you are, so for instance, a swamp, the amount of bacteria and organisms that are living in that swampy, silty soil is going to be a whole lot more than, say, what's living in, let's say, a desert environment or a very sandy mixture. There's probably some living organisms within that mixture, but it's not as much versus one or the other. In a lot of soil, again, depending upon the mixture, but there are billions and billions and trillions and quadrillions of microorganisms, bacteria. And this is important because there are things that feed on them. And then there are things that feed on those things, and then there are things that feed on those things, and it's a whole crazy circle of life. But we have this bacteria in there, there's fungi in the ground, and all of the way they communicate in the gases that they release and the gases that they absorb and how they move nutrients through the soil is basically what kind of makes everything grow to one extent or another. So the soil beneath our feet is quite important. For instance, worms. Well, what are worms eating? Well, worms are eating probably a lot of the rotting organic material that's in the ground. They're probably eating a lot of the other microorganisms that are in that soil. So when they release their waste, that feeds other bacteria and other organisms and so on and so forth. And then there's things that eat the worms and so on and so forth. And it keeps growing from there. Soil beneath our feet is very important. And I'm going to touch more about improving your soil and things you can do and how you can help your soil to help you better as a gardener in a minute. There's a ton of terminology that's thrown around with gardening. And if you understand the basics of each of those terms, then you'll be more successful as a gardener. So let's start off with topsoil. What is topsoil? It's usually the first, let's say, 3 to maybe 6 inches of what's underneath your feet in a regular average yard. It's made up of sand and silt and clay and humus, and it's generally denser than other materials, i.e. sand or compost, and I'll talk more about those terms in a minute. So if you go to the store to buy topsoil, you're going to expect that you're probably going to have some sort of combination of, again, sand, silt, maybe a peat, and it's, again, usually a denser material. Topsoil is not something that you generally want to either use as a general garden mixture, something that you're going to plant your shrubs into, or it's something that you're definitely not going to want to start your, say, seedlings into. If you go to a store and you buy a bag of topsoil, it'll be made up of various mixtures, but generally be much denser than some of these other things we're going to talk about. And the next one I'm going to touch on is humus. And humus is, I don't see the term used too much, but it is kind of important because humus is, as I just mentioned, you may find it in mixtures of topsoil. According to the definition here, it's rich, highly decomposed material. The next term, which is commonly used, and you'll hear it all over the place, is compost. Compost is sort of the end-all, be-all, almost miracle type of material you want for gardening. It is the base for everything from potting mixes to building out your garden itself. And all compost is basically rotted food material, rotted plant material, rotted animal manure. So it could be cow manure, horse manure, that kind of thing. But it's just rotted organic waste. It's broken down by all sorts of microorganisms and bacteria within that pile that are just eating all that material. And they're just feeding on the rotting leaves and the rotting grass clippings and the rotting wood, etc., etc. And they break it all down into now humus, if you left it alone long enough. So compost is really just rotting organic material, but because it has all those bacteria in it and some fungi in it, and now it's just, there's all sorts of nutrients that come from that, and they create nutrients within the compost itself, which is then a wonderful product to spread all over your garden to use for all sorts of various things. The next one is leaf mold. If I had a large deciduous forest around me, I would just be collecting gobs and gobs and gobs of leaves every year to create leaf mold, because leaf mold is just rotting leaves, and they just break down into this wonderful material that you can again use for all sorts of things. Now, unlike compost, which is primarily broken down by bacteria, leaf mold is broken down by fungi. But again, it has its own benefits to use in the garden, whether you want to use it for potting soil or to improve your ground soil, or just use it as a mulch. It's just a wonderful product. Potting soils are various mixtures of a lot of the terms that we've already used here, and they can include perlite, vermiculite, coir, or peat moss, bark, compost, various animal manures. I use a local vendor down here called Daddy Pete, And in their potting mix, they put bat manure, bat guano, and cow manure, composted cow manure, pine bark, which is readily available here in the South with all the pine trees we have. And if you go to any big box store or any nursery and you look at the ingredients within those potting soil mixture bags, you'll find different mixtures. And you can make your own potting soil as well. So now you have a general idea of hopefully some of these terms, and that the soil beneath our feet is important because it has all these good and beneficial things in it that we need to grow our plants. I've mentioned how cruddy my soil is, and maybe you have a very clay-based soil, or as I use my extreme example of Long Island, New York, which is basically a sandbar. How do you grow certain things in there? And as gardeners, this is where things like compost comes in super helpful. So whenever I plant a tree or I plant a shrub out in my garden, I dig a hole of a certain size and then I'll add in a lot of compost. The compost is good for the tree. It allows free water to drain away from the tree because it's very loose. The other good factor about that is that that bacteria that's in that compost will help the tree in various ways, and the things like earthworms that are out in the surrounding ground will come in. And when they come in to feed on that compost to help break that down, they'll release their own waste, which is a good fertilizer for trees and shrubs and that kind of thing. So therefore, compost is really good for amending the soil. So if you have a very clay-based soil, it'll loosen up when you add compost. If you have a very sandy soil, you're adding organic matter to that sandy soil, which will help it retain moisture and again, give your plants something to feed on. Now, one of the things that I've done here in this garden, as opposed to digging holes and putting trees in with lots of compost, is I've gardened with a method called no dig. And no dig has a couple of benefits. So when I built out my flower garden, the old school method would be to dig out your beds and fill them with compost. And that is just a ton, literally for my garden, it would probably be about, for my flower garden, it would be probably about 10 tons of compost. And that's just my borders. That's not even including any of the other flower beds I have, but it would just be too, and it's a lot of work too. It's a lot of physical work doing that, but this is the way they used to do it. So now no dig is a whole lot simpler. And the basics is that you cover your ground, the area that you want to plant in, with cardboard. And then on top of that, you place anywhere from 6 to 8 inches of compost. You're essentially making like sort of like a mini raised bed. Where you're going to plant into that. A lot of flowers and a lot of small plants do not spread their roots out beyond 6 to 8 inches. And then you'll notice that after let's say a year or two, that what you piled up will start to flatten out. You can add more compost to those beds and as you continue to plant in them. But what I've discovered over the years is that my oldest area of my flower garden, I can now dig 4 to 6 inches down and be hitting good, loose, fertile soil versus before where it was 2 to 3 inches of maybe topsoil and then the rest is just silty loam. I discovered the no dig method by watching another gardener called Charles Dowding, and he's a whole thing going on, but he promotes no dig. He's built an entire market garden with no dig. If you haven't heard of him or haven't seen him, go check him out. He's over in the UK, but a lot of the methods that he uses, it helps to promote good soil conservation. So you want to start a garden. And now that I've given you all this information, you say, Jason, I just want to grow vegetables in a raised bed. What do I do? Well, don't go buying topsoil, because again, topsoil is denser, it's heavier, and it's not as free draining as, let's say, a raised bed mix. A lot of stores now will sell a raised bed mix. It's a very loose and free draining mixture, so that when you fill your raised bed with this raised bed mix, should be nutritionally good because it has compost in it, which has good nutrients for the soil in there, and then it should be free draining enough to allow excess water that your plants don't need to drain away. So stay away from the topsoil. Topsoil is no good for a raised bed. You can, it's not going to necessarily kill your plants, but it may stunt your plants' growth. It may not provide enough nutritional value for your plants. So I would stay away from the topsoils and maybe go for a raised bed mix. Or for instance, potting soil. Potting soils, again, are formulated differently. They're formulated for usually pots, and they need to be super free draining, because pots generally only have one drain hole. You don't want to hold on to too much moisture. You'll also see, if you go to some of the big box stores, or again, maybe your local garden center, various bags of, let's say, potting mix that will have pellets in them to help retain moisture. And this way you don't have to water your plants as much, so the plants don't dry out as quickly. But again, you can make up your own potting soils at home using various combinations of, let's say, topsoil or compost or leaf mold and vermiculite and animal manure, and you can search the web, and again, that's a whole, making your own potting soil at home, or even seed starting mix is a whole nother bag of worms. Seed starting mix is actually one I didn't have written down in my book, but now that I mention it, let me touch on it real quick. Seed starting mix depends upon the manufacturer, but it's a very fine soil mixture. It may be made up of humus, which is, like I said, highly composted compost, perlite, vermiculite, but it's usually a very, very fine material, and it's usually very free draining because of all the other stuff that they've mixed into it. Maybe a little bit of sand, coir, peat. Again, it depends upon the manufacturer and the mix that the formula that they used. And I will probably touch more on seed starting mixes in a future video when I start my seeds. If you guys have any questions, comments, etc., please leave them below. Again, experienced gardeners, if I've missed something, if I've said something incorrectly, if you want to add to something that I've said, please leave those comments below. And again, if you're just starting off gardening, if you have questions, please ask those questions below, because somebody from the community or myself may answer those questions, or somebody from the community may have said something that clarifies and or adds to something I've missed today. It's cold. I want to go back inside. So with all that being said, I'm going to catch you guys on the next one. Bye-bye.